So next we'll have our first panel. I'd like to invite Laura Choi, the Research Director of the Community Development Department at the San Francisco Fed, and her panel. So come on up, Penelope, Rip. It's a special pleasure to introduce Laura. She and I have worked together for many years. When she was a master's student and at Berkeley 15 years ago, she did her project on community development finance, and she presented it in this building, and there was a standing ovation. And I knew then I needed to hire her, and I did. And we worked together for many years. And you will probably be on your feet at the end of this because she'll be such a good, amazing moderator. So Laura, take it away.
Thank you, David. For those of you who know David, he loves to be generous and set very high expectations. My fear is always, oh, I'm going to let everyone down after David introduces me. But special thanks to David and the New York Fed for hosting us today. It's a real privilege to be here today with you, so thank you, David. And thank you to our partners at PolicyLink and ArtPlace just for the incredible opportunity to co-edit this journal in partnership. It was such a privilege. So I'm Laura Choi with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. It's a real honor to be here at this event with all of you and with our illustrious panel, all of whom had a direct hand in the journal. They were authors and contributors, so it's really nice to be able to hear their voices today. I'll just do a little bit of framing. Apologies to all of you, my back is to you. I'm gonna hope I don't fall off the stage here, but there we go. I'll do a little bit of framing, but we really want to spend most of the time hearing from our panelists, their perspectives on this topic. So within the community development field, as we heard Liz alluding to, we often talk about the need for cross-sector partnerships and having to break down organizational silos. And this is key because we know that the issues that underlie poverty are complex and interconnected. But our current funding streams, policies, and practices often remain siloed. So this question of how do we do that? How do we break down organizational silos? How do we do cross-sector work? We're still bound within the frame of our existing institutions. So the question is, how can we push beyond what we already know? How can we be bolder in thinking about community development work? And that's where the role of arts and culture comes in. Artists have the ability to force community development, frankly, because we need to be forced, to be more creative, to think beyond what we already know, what we're comfortable with. So this panel is titled Shifting Mindsets, the Role of Arts and Culture in Building Equitable Futures. And we're here to explore the premise that arts and culture bearers can transform the practice of community development and help us truly reimagine what's possible. So it's an honor to kick off this conversation with these four folks. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But I'm going to ask them to share the brief story as part of your introduction. When did you first come to understand the important role that arts and culture would play in your own work? Why don't we start with you, Rip?
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rip Rapson. I'm the president of the Kresge Foundation. We're based in Detroit, Michigan. Let me go back probably 20 years. I was serving in the Minneapolis mayor's office, and we had just received a grant from the Dayton-Hudson Foundation to launch something called Culture Talks, which was going to be a year-long community conversation about the role that arts and culture plays in the city's evolution, and in particular in the city's community development process. And I had to go before the Ways and Means Committee of the City Council, chaired by Walter Dietzick. And Walter Dietzick was the toughest, most ornery guy on the council and had no time for any of this nonsense, and basically said so. He said, essentially, why in the world would we approve a grant to have a bunch of talk about art? And I said, well, would you give me 2 days of your time, and we'll come back next week and you can ask the same question. So Walter represented a part of Minneapolis, northeast Minneapolis, which is very ethnic, very Russian, Ukrainian mix of folks, and he came out of a very rich sort of ethnic heritage. And so I arranged a meeting at his largest Ukrainian church. And without a whole lot of choreography, we sat and heard from the woman who did the vestments, the choir director, the person who had painted the stained glass. I mean, just, you can imagine, just on and on and on. And Dietzick kind of looked at me and he said, was this a setup? And I said, well, yeah, kind of. He said, but I can't imagine that this is true in all of the rest of the city. You know, this is a very special part of the city. And I said, if you go to the south, Native American community, you would have a very similar conversation, perhaps in different form. If you went into the north side and had the same conversation at a Black Baptist church, you would have a very similar conversation, and on and on and on. So to make a long, not very interesting story short, came back to the Ways and Means Committee. He approved the grant, and Walter became one of the chief proponents over the next couple of years of genuinely trying to integrate arts and culture into the community development fabric of the city. And I think in many ways it began Minneapolis's journey, which has, I think, continued to this day to be really edgy about how these worlds can mix. They have public works engineers who talk about arts and culture at the very early stages of their major projects. They have highway engineers who do the same, and I give Walter all the credit.
Great, thank you. Jamie, how about you?
Hi. Hello. Oh, hello. I'm Jamie Gaudier, a newly sworn-in district council member in Philadelphia. Thank you. I am a city planner by trade, and I've spent the past 15 years working in nonprofit, community, and economic development. Started off working at LISC for several years, also led several community and economic development-focused nonprofits, including, right before I ran for council, the Fairmount Park Conservancy, which works very closely with residents and the city's Parks and Rec department to make improvements in the park and to raise money for public parks in Philly, and also to facilitate volunteerism. And so I've been involved in community development for a long time, and certainly I've always been aware of the role that arts and culture can play. A lot of you have heard about the Mural Arts program in Philadelphia, right? That's been a program that's partnered with CDCs and other community-based organizations for some time. I've been involved in revitalization efforts targeted towards neighborhood corridors that use arts as a strategy. But I think the role, that arts and culture can play and the power of it became most apparent to me when I was executive director of the Conservancy. When I came to the organization, we were newly granted an award through the ArtPlace CDI program, and we used those funds to engage with residents in the Strawberry Mansion community. And, it really changed the way that we worked as an organization, and it allowed us to build a lot of trust that wasn't there previously with the community. It allowed us to highlight the community's history and culture in a gentrifying neighborhood, and it allowed us to do better and more effective engagement and programming. And so happy to talk more about that work as we go along.
Great, thank you so much, Jamie. Maurice, how about you?
Well, good afternoon. It's nice to be with all of you all, and nice to be in this beautiful space. I'm Maurice Jones with LISC. I can't remember exactly when the first time was that I had an epiphany about the role that art and culture could play in community development. I do remember, though, distinctly when I've been in this job 3 years. Before I did this job, I was the Secretary of Commerce and Trade for the state of Virginia. And that meant that I was the Chief Economic Development Officer. And I'll never forget, I was in a small town in the western part of the state, which used to be coal country. And they bought me because they wanted me to see the economic development efforts that this small town was engaging in to transform its city or I should say, the town, to the next chapter, and they took me to a theater. I thought sure they were going to take me to some small business that they wanted me to see, but no, they took me to this theater and they showed me the efforts that the town was taking to restore a theater that was over 100 years old. And they proceeded to tell me the story of this theater and the meaning and the significance of this theater for the town, and how much it had been really the convener for this town for years, and that it was important to bring it back, yes, for the economic vitality of the downtown, but even more importantly, because of the stories that that theater represented for the history of the community. And that was one of those moments where I realized that this was bigger than a transaction, right? That this was more than New Markets tax credits, that this was really about how you bring back to life, in this case, an entity that contained stories that could really tell you about the heart and soul of that community, and that for people around meant way more than any dollar amount you could put on it. I think that was one of those moments when I realized, yep, art, culture, and the institutions that allow us to actually perform art and culture or do it or make it are really central to the work that community developers are trying to do.
Penelope?
Hi, everybody. I'm Penelope Douglas, and I am a co-founder of Culture Bank, which is housed at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in the Bay Area, an organization that really is about providing a forum for how art and culture and the best ideas we have can move us forward. And my colleague, Deborah Cullinan, the CEO of YBCA, is here. We also, YBCA, I should mention, had the chance to host the amazing event that took place that Liz alluded to, that was kind of the inaugural of what this is the follow-up and wonderful successor to here in New York. Mine's a very personal story. I have a long career as a community development investment professional, also in social finance and impact investing. I'm also an artist. The first time I had this transformation was when I was not quite 30, and I was serving as the very young, unseasoned board of directors chair of a small community-based organization in San Francisco that was working on the issue of street youth at a time when street kids were not interesting to anybody, and HIV was becoming a very big problem. And what we were going through was a strategic conflict internally, where half the staff of this great community-based organization thought that to bring these kids to a healthier place meant that we needed to get them off the streets, and the other half of whom had a different question in mind, and they wanted to pursue the question with the kids. We had an artist named Peter Karpu who was working with the kids at the same time. It turned out that the outcome of this strategic conflict was the one that made more sense and transformed me, which was that the kids and Peter defined what a community meant to street kids, and that's how the organization continued its work in fulfilling its mission. It wasn't about what I saw as a community for street kids. The second transformation took place just a couple of years ago, and it's, again, quite personal, and it's as a result of two invitations, one from my colleague David Erickson, then at the San Francisco Fed, and the other from my colleague Deborah Cullinan at YBCA, each of whom asked me to do a small residency, an artist in residency, simultaneously with one at the Federal Reserve Bank. Having just gone down to see the gold downstairs, this is a particularly poignant story for me to tell you now, but the point of my transformation was only allowed by virtue of an invitation. It was the invitation from two great thinkers to actually expose myself to the opportunity to look at the question of why I felt community development investment was largely failing by using my artist's lens along with the experience that I had gained as an investor. So those were my transformations.
That's great. Thank you, Penelope. Thank you, all of you. I love hearing these stories of personal transformation because each of you touched on, ultimately, the arts and culture got to the heart of what mattered for that community that you were working with. And I think that's the goal of what we're talking about today. So I want to spend some time talking about the end goal of an equitable future as part of our title for our panel here. Maurice, maybe we can start with you. Your essay discusses how creative placemaking with a racial equity lens can connect the issues of economic prosperity, community power, and cultural understanding. Why is it so important to hold all of these things together, and how are you doing that through the work at LISC? Big question, I know.
You all better sit back. So I think so for us, you need to do all three to actually get at the notion of equity, right? For us, equity includes making sure that the voice of the people of the place where you're working is at the table from day one, right? And that's always a humbling reminder lesson that we have to remember and practice and repeat. Because unless that's the case, this notion of equity doesn't follow. And by the same token, what that means is, at the end of the day, to put it crassly, equity is about power, right? It's who has the power to make choices. And then thirdly, we're all trying to pursue economic progress for the people and for the places, right? And so that's that for us. Arts and culture help to bring the three together, and we think you have to hold the three collectively if you're going to achieve anything close to an equitable outcome and something that's sustainable. And so that's why it's important for us, and that's why we get up and try to pursue them all simultaneously, because if you don't have all three, the notion of equity and sustainable equity in particular is a risky proposition.
Maurice, can I push a little bit on you? A couple of years ago, before Maurice came to LISC, I had a long conversation with my good friend Michael Rubinger, who was Maurice's predecessor. And Kresge was proposing to sort of lodge in LISC a new capacity to think about arts and culture as part of their development. And I got to tell you that the institutional culture was really resistant. Michael is a wonderful human being, and all the disclaimers in the world, but boy, the way he saw community development, Colvin, you probably remember, was pretty narrow, pretty technocratic, and this essentially, I think, in Michael's early view, kind of got in the way. But we kind of plowed on, and he sort of agreed to take it up. And when I look at what path LISC has taken in the last couple of years, it's just remarkable. I mean, the extent to which this has genuinely seemed to become part of the way you think about community development. I don't mean to cut other people out of the conversation, but I'm just wondering if you could talk about how did that take? Because that's so much part of the challenge we have, is this sort of resistance culture, whether it's out of our traditional community development infrastructure, whether it's out of the public sector, whether it's out of our banking community, whatever it is.
Well, I think a couple of things, and I'll try to be brief. I'll give you an example. We were trying to figure out how to do more in the green housing space, right? How to better connect housing and health, right? Well, we discovered that art could be a big piece of that because, and we stumbled on this, we did a project with a developer in Brooklyn, and we brought an artist in at the very beginning, and that artist actually painted murals in the hallway, in the stairways. And we discovered that people were using the stairs more because they wanted to see the art, right? And we were like, of course, art has a role for us there. Same thing, we were looking for groups in the community through which we could do work. And in the Twin Cities, we stumbled upon this husband-wife team, both of whom were artists, who opened basically a small studio in an intersection that was basically abandoned, disinvested. And they set up their studio, and they set up a small graphic arts business. And guess what happened? Other businesses came and bought up other abandoned buildings in that intersection, and they eventually ended up setting up an internship program for youth. So part of this was us, a friend in need is a friend indeed, right? Us realizing that we were just being way too narrow to pursue community development objectives, and that we were not taking advantage of a huge asset that we find in every community that we work in, urban and rural. And so that's really what has pushed us to, I think, be better in this space. It also helps when a funder comes to you and says, you're not doing a good job, right? But that's for another day.
All right, thank you. And Rip, no need to apologize. This is what a good panel should be, in my opinion. This is conversation among all of us, not just me to the four of you. So I invite all of you to please engage in conversation with each other. No, sorry. This is good. This is what we want. Thank you, Rip. That's great. Jamie, let's turn to you maybe. I want to hear your story. In the journal, you talked about some of the fears that were happening in the Strawberry Mansion neighborhood around gentrification and displacement. Can you tell us a little bit more about that story and how artists in particular help to build trust to identify the priorities of residents and why this was critical for ensuring equitable outcomes in this work?
Just a little context. Philadelphia is a changing city. After decades of population decline, we started to gain population around 2010 and have been gaining ever since, right? And that's absolutely changing the way that we look at community development in the city. And so when I came to the Conservancy, we had just been awarded the ArtPlace grant, and the Conservancy had been working for a few years to try to bring to life a project in East Fairmount Park called Mander to the River. And just to set a little context about Strawberry Mansion. So Strawberry Mansion is a neighborhood nearest to East Fairmount Park. In the past, it was a neighborhood where wealthy and middle-class Jewish people lived until they left the neighborhood in about the 50s and 60s. And today, it's a mostly poor and working class, predominantly African-American neighborhood. It borders Brewery Town, which is one of the most gentrifying neighborhoods in the city. Its place next to the park also makes it attractive. Lots of the newer folks coming to the city want to be near the park and all of the park's assets. So it's a neighborhood that's experiencing a lot of development pressure. At the same time, there's a lot of poverty. Its high school is set to close. It's a neighborhood that experiences a lot of crime. So this is the context. And so the Conservancy had been trying to bring to life this Mander to the River trail project that would connect make better pedestrian connections between East Fairmount Park and the Schuylkill River. And the community really didn't want this project, right? They didn't see it as a high priority for them and their neighborhood. And they also saw it as something that would catalyze gentrification. They started calling the project the River to Mander because they saw it as something that would bring outsiders into the neighborhood and lead to gentrification faster. And so this project essentially died in the water, right? But the ArtPlace grant provided us with a new opportunity to kind of look at our work in East Fairmount Park and look at our work with the community. At the time, Ellen Ryan, who's in the audience, was our director of strategy and planning at the Conservancy, and she led a lot of this work, and I had the pleasure of working with her on it. And so we essentially used the ArtPlace grant as a way to look at this work much differently and as a way to pause. So we started by setting the ground rules with the community. We built a steering committee that consisted of Conservancy staff members and leaders from the community. People were paid for their time, and we co-created. And everyone had a voice and a place at the table, and we didn't come to the table with any preconceived notions of what would be delivered. One of my favorite things that we did was to activate the Hatfield House. So the Hatfield House is one of the historic park houses in Fairmount Park. And for many years, it sat unactivated in the Strawberry Mansion community. It's a beautiful, stately house, even though it needs a lot of TLC. But it's this house that people would just walk by and couldn't go inside, right? And so we used the ArtPlace funds to start an artist in residency with a group called Amber Arts. And they worked with the community to activate the house. And so it went from this, kind of vacant place to a space where we would show movies and have jazz concerts and community picnics and community art showings, right? And in comparison, a lot of the historic houses and park houses in Philadelphia are house museums. And so I thought this one was the coolest one in the city. And so we did a series of small projects, like, activating the house in different ways. We created a card deck that represented Strawberry Mansion, and so it was a real playing card deck that had cards showing everyone from Meek Mill to neighborhood community leaders, and it really was a way of highlighting the assets in the community. We had a photography camp for youth where the kids went and took pictures in the park and around their neighborhood and displayed them in the house. And so these series of small projects allowed us to approach much bigger projects as we built trust. And we winded up pushing aside the trail project essentially and put the bulk of the money into re-envisioning the Mander Rec Center in preparation for larger capital investment that's set to come from the city. And so, through this year-long process, we built enough trust between us to take on this large capital project as a coalition. And we also winded up highlighting the history and the culture of Strawberry Mansion in a time where it's changing. And so it was a worthwhile process for our organization, and it also fundamentally changed the way that we did engagement.
Thank you. I think that's one of the themes that comes up a lot. You alluded to going into it, you didn't know what was going to come out of it, and that openness to the process and trusting the process, trusting that the partnership with artists and culture bearers would lead you to to a good outcome, but you had to trust that you would get there. That definitely came up a lot. Rip, I'm going to turn back to you. You and Michael McAfee of PolicyLink have an essay on why arts and culture strategies are central to equitable development. And one of the themes of that piece is about widening the lens and taking a new approach to problem solving. So how does incorporating arts and culture into community development allow us to broaden our understanding of the problem and what the potential solutions might be?
I think I want to get Liz Crane back up and just kind of repeat what she said, because in many ways, the proposition is so self-evident that it's almost, the question is almost, how can we not have arts and culture be at the core of community development? But that having been said, it changes the who, it changes the how, and it changes the what. And in all three ways, whether it's to be intentional about gentrification, or whether it's to get out in front of tough economic development challenges, or whether it's to get adjacent to new forms of capital, the idea of the who is absolutely central. You just simply, as Maurice said, you simply have to place community voice at the front end and the center of the conversations. Any good community development is going to have to get there at some point, and tagging it on in the end does you very, very little good. The integration of community voice, community history, community wisdom just permits you, I think, at the end of the game to get to wherever you need to go in a way that makes much more sense. The how, I think, has a lot to do with getting giving our community development systems permission to move outside sort of a fairly technical, boxed-in way of working. When you think of a traffic engineer or a housing developer or any of the other community development professionals we all work with, it's really easy to get quantitative quickly, and it's easy to move back to sort of your algorithm of cars per second or housing units per square block or square mile or something like that. I think the possibility of sort of giving greater latitude to decision makers to ask the kind of questions that Liz mentioned, that just the problems you think you may be solving are actually not the problems you actually need to solve. And I think arts and culture workers almost invariably help people see that. And I think the what is probably the most important. There's a wonderful author named Carlton Turner who refers to arts and culture as creating dark matter. It's the stuff that's really hard to measure, but that is essential to community fabric. It's social capital, it's history, it's heritage, it's identity, it's all of the things that our community development system doesn't do a particularly good job at measuring. And so at the end of the day, not only do you get a traditional community development product, I would suggest that you get dark matter. You get the kinds of things that over time cohere for community and permit community to grow. I know in Detroit, we're having a difficult conversation about how does the so-called return of Detroit mesh with the 700,000 people who have been in Detroit for the last 40 years and who have been slogging it out day to day. And our early impression is one of the only bridges to that conversation is through arts and culture, because how else can you sort of hold simultaneously your past, your current, and your future? And it creates a sort of a bridge among the past state, the current state, and the future state in a way that no technical community development process can do. So I would actually argue that the product is very different when you inject arts and culture into it.
Can I chime in quickly? I also think injecting arts and culture has a way of centering residents and the people who are there in a way that's difficult to do if you use more sort of traditional forms of community development. When I came to the Conservancy and we were trying to undertake this work with Strawberry Mansion, they essentially saw us as a white organization, a white institution, and they saw us as outsiders. And I think stepping back from the project that we had originally gone to the community with and allowing for space for the community to create and offer up what was important to them through arts and culture, it changed the dynamics of the relationship and the way that we were communicating to one another.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, I think this theme of needing to really challenge the way our current systems are working and the rigidity of some of those systems is really key to this. And actually, Penelope, that leads us to the question I wanted to ask you about investments. Your article talks about the importance of investing in culture as a first step in community investment. Why do you think it's so critical to place artists centrally in community investment strategies? And how does this approach lead to more equitable outcomes?
I'll try to stay focused on that, although I'm also trying to respond to
Please
this
feel
because
free
I'm
to
trying to
reflect
wade
on
into
what-
this
I know,
conversation here.
There's a lot here.
First of all, context. Culture Bank is in the midst of a pilot phase in 3 locations, and we're well into that pilot. And so I just want you to sort of understand that I'm speaking about the concrete, not just the theoretical when I'm describing my experience, when I'm describing my point of view. Here's the thing. I mean, we're talking about power, and we're talking about these questions of how we shift community investment. And in my view, one of the odd things about community investment, having been in community investment, is that in a way we only think about rigor in community investment when we think about transactions and financial capital. And my entreaty is that we need to understand because of this question of power, because of the question of how critical culture is to driving long-term change, we need to really understand the rigor that it's going to require of all of us to experiment, and also to dive much more deeply into the processes like the one you used in Fairmount, the processes that I can name 20 people in this room whom I regard highly, understand how to use, but which are not the processes that we all systemically believe are essential to investing in the conditions that will create more productive community investment. And it's that idea that we need to consider value and power in a system of investment that's really intriguing to me. Communities that are considered poor, considered under great stress, have community assets of all kinds. And those are the assets that are most powerfully going to serve those communities' long-term health and well-being. And artists are those who know how to build and or activate trusted places where conversations can be held about these kinds of questions. They know exactly how to illuminate this kind of community wealth for purposes of these longer-term, more equitable outcomes. They are, in fact, early investors in communities, and therefore, to me, they're critical actors. And for us, the question is, how do we then consider how to invest in a way that is just not the muscle that anyone who would consider themselves an investor is typically using. I also think we have to be really careful about identifying that we're in several conversations at once, all of which are important, and each of which is distinct. And so we can talk about that maybe as part of our closing, but the mistake that many in the social entrepreneurship world, which I've also been played a lot of time in, is you mash everything together into one conversation called social entrepreneurship, and then you expect funders and others to sort of follow along. And I think we need to take great care, if we're going to place artists so critically at the center of new community investment strategies, to also define very clearly all the ways in which we're going to do that, and not make the mistakes that we've made before.
I'm wondering how many proof points make the pie? I mean, I think of the Bay Area and all the extraordinary work coming out of Oakland, the East Bay, that clearly demonstrate that this is an effective model for community organizing, getting community projects done, and attracting social finance. At what point do we have to stop making the case?
That's a great question. You know, if I'm following your question, and by the way, our pilots actually are farther along in Dallas and in Kansas City, Missouri, than they are in Oakland, and I admit purposefully so, because I don't want to consider the bubble of the Bay Area as the only place where we try to make a case, because I just don't think that's wise. But I think my point of view is that we need to be better at what I would call gathering evidence, and we need to have as much evidence gathered among us as quickly as possible that shows the early signs of the kind of outcomes that artists can achieve. And I'd move there now. I would off cases and to really trying to build up our evidence base. That's what I would do if I were, you know, the king of the zoo or whatever you call it. But I also I think we have to be willing also to continue to tell the stories of where the artist is having impact. And for me, that is a case I want to keep making. So I think I'm answering your question. I think we need to be willing to understand that much as we did in early community investment, we need to start to do some massive experimentation along with continuing to develop cases with rigor.
Thank you. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left. I want to return to this theme of shifting mindsets and this idea that a lot needs to change and shift. And I'm going to ask each of you to reflect on the different parts of the community development ecosystem that you represent and really think about what needs to shift. So Maurice, why don't we start with you? How is arts and culture shifting the practice of LISC as a CDFI, and what kinds of shifts do you think need to happen more broadly in the CDFI community?
So, and I think Rip's question really hit on this for us. What it's doing to us is it is causing us to not segregate arts and culture as an art and culture thing, if you will. It is inviting us to become better at understanding how arts and culture play a role in housing, how arts and culture play a role in safety, how it plays a role in economic development. I'll give you an example. We did a project in Brockton, Massachusetts, and we were working in a food desert. And folks wanted us to come in and help to actually get a grocery store or some kind of market and finance it in this food desert. And when we talked to people about it, they said, nah, it can't be done. We can't, it won't be economically viable. Well, guess what? What we discovered after a while was actually we could find an economically viable grocery store to finance, but it had to be one that had foods and culture that catered to the Cape Verdean community, because that was the community that was living in Brockton. Imagine that, right? So we went in to an abandoned lot that had been abandoned for 20 years and co-located a federally qualified healthcare center and a grocery store catering to Cape Verdean taste, spices, foods, etc. Guess what? That was 10 years ago. That store's making money, right? And so what we have to be better at is integrating arts and culture into community development work, period. Better understanding that they are assets, tools, strategies that we have to learn to be good at to do our work. That's the mindset change that, no, it's not art and culture out here and then community development over here. Nope, they are one and the same.
That's great, thank you.
You know, it's so funny to hear that example first, because we were one of the early investors in that, and I can't tell you how skeptical our social investment people were. Said, why?
I was going to mention philanthropy, but
sorry, just the quick embellishment is that a couple of years ago, based on this example, Kresge decided to go out and just do an RFP that seemed cockamamie at the time, called Fresh, Local, and Equitable. It was what's called Fresh Low. It was the idea that you could conjoin fresh food, economic development, and particularly in food deserts, with arts and cultural activity. We had no idea what we would get. In all of the years of Kresge, we have never received so many responses. We had 600 responses to that request. We're now in our third round of Fresh Low grants, and it is example after example after example of how these systems actually are the same system. They're not divergent systems, they're the same system. Sometimes it's a complex real estate transaction that's got to get put together. Other times, south side of Chicago, we had a group of artists just organizing arts events outside a convenience store that was trying to, peddle the classic chips and pop to the local residents. And by joining the arts activity, we were able to sort of encourage the store owner to offer different kinds of, they were able to encourage the store owner to offer different kinds of fresh food. And now it's a completely transformational project. I mean, time and time and time again. I just think we have this sort of sense that these are distinct systems. Yeah. They're not.
Actually, Rip, I'll ask you to continue. The question I was going to ask you was, how is Kresge leveraging its arts and culture investments? I think you started to alluding to that. Leveraging those investments to shift community development practice, and the bigger question is, what further shifts do you think need to happen across philanthropy broadly?
Maybe I could, Liz is not there, give a sort of a shameless plug for ArtPlace. My sense is that what ArtPlace has done is essentially what she described and what you've asked. It's helped redefine the narrative. I think it's a lot of what we're talking about here. It's created multiple models across the country. I mean, ArtPlace has made, what, 1,000 grants? I don't know how many tens of millions of dollars it's invested. It's not just the money, it's not just the grants, but it's the proof points, these sort of points of illumination that are just so powerful. It's helped our national intermediary partners, whether it's in health or transportation or housing or criminal justice, see their way to a different way of integrating the work. It's working with folks like the Fed, who are sort of unnatural partners, if I may. You're better than most, but sorry. The Fed, you know, when we first thought that the Fed would be a natural convener, I think we ran into all sorts of skepticism. This is not their bailiwick. They don't think about this, but David and Laura and others sort of grabbed it. Sort of those sorts of platforms to sort of elevate and disseminate, and then people like PolicyLink who are doing some of the tough research and trying to do the kind of quantification and validation that is so important. That is something that philanthropy can do. Ultimately, we're not LISC, we're not the Philadelphia City Council, but we can take this sort of social venture capital and help create an infrastructure that helps hold the work.
That's great, thank you. I think that acknowledgement, right, in the roles that each of us play, we are part of this broader ecosystem, and we need to think how each of us can shift to change those broader conditions. So I love that, thank you. Jamie, I'll turn to you and ask, how do you think community-based organizations can shift their practices to promote a more equitable future, and what is the role of arts and culture in that process?
Sure. So I came out of planning school in '04 and went immediately to work for LISC. And at that time, we were still building in distressed communities, right? I think that was a mindset of community development and what CDCs were doing across the country. And if the goal of what we were doing was to catalyze the private market, then like we worked. I mean, it worked, right? We arrived, right? And so now people are coming to cities from all over. And so I think the role of community-based organizations in this time has to be about equity, whether we're the ones building the real estate or not. And I think that's about making sure that as many folks' voices are being reflected as possible, making sure that we're investing in community engagement infrastructure and the capacity of grassroots organizations in neighborhoods, using zoning and policy as a way of facilitating equitable development, and continuing to build where necessary. But I think it's a much broader role than previously. And I think arts and culture plays a strong role in that. It plays, obviously, a role in authentic engagement and making sure that residents' voices are centered. It plays a role in preserving history and culture. As all of this development is happening, our cities could be any town, you know, any place, right? My chief of staff has a joke that a lot of the housing we're seeing going up in Philadelphia looks like IKEA homes, right? It looks like people just came and, you know, kind of put them together and they all look the same. And so I think arts and culture has a strong role in preserving a sense of place. You know, that was a lot of the work that Ellen and I were trying to carry out at the Conservancy. No matter who comes to Strawberry Mansion, we help to place the community's identity on Fairmount Park and to highlight the community's history so that newcomers know, you know, the history of this place that they're coming to. And I think that will continue to be important in communities across the country. And also, I see my role as a district council member in bringing everything that I learned in the nonprofit community and economic development world to this legislative position. City Council in Philly, at least, has an enormous impact on land use and development in the city. And so I see, you know, myself as taking all of these things that I learned with an eye towards equitable development. And my district is one of the fastest developing set of communities in the city. So.
That's great. Congratulations again. They're lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Penelope, I want to return back to some of the things you alluded to in your prior remarks about these changes that need to happen in the broader investment community to enable this type of work to really flourish. Can you expand a little bit on that? What are some of those changes that you want to see within the investment community?
Well, I'm going to be very specific in a minute, but before I am, I go back to what Maurice was talking about in this kind of total integration, and I only want to keep encouraging us all to really use that kind of excruciating patience. What's Neruda's line? The burning patience, because I don't know that I hear us yet describing what it looks like to invest in culture. For example, what does it look like to invest in a culture of health in name the place? And so that's my encouragement. As far as being more specific, I think at a relatively practical and very concrete level, we have a really interesting moment in time which I hope we capitalize on. I feel this conversation is about to bust wide open, and there are lots of people here who carry the weight of having been the early pioneers in that, Ruby and Andrea and others. But this is what I see. I see a large number of really vibrant, culturally important artist enterprises in communities that have perhaps been harmed unintentionally by our investment strategies. And those enterprises are either investable or nearly investable, and they are good to look at. And we need to be sure that we have community investment and social capital working as powerfully together as possible to execute on that strategy, with ArtPlace, of course, having led the way. That's really important. Separately, and also importantly, there are artists leading organizations and enterprises. Some of them would call themselves arts and culture organizations. Some of them might be collaborations like Culture Bank. Some of them might be called projects. But these are really important initiatives led by people who believe that we're at such a tipping point in our capitalism approach to community investment that we need to find an alternative model. And those are equally important to look at, and they're very important to support. And this is where I feel some of this radical experimentation, 5 years, let's call it, worth of just experimentation with what it would look like and feel like to exchange value in ways that are very uncomfortable to us who hold capital, because it's already happening at the project level with some of these very interesting projects. And we should find out what will happen, because we should find out how important that is to a culture of equity and longer-term sustainable outcomes for the health and well-being of communities.
That's great. I want to thank each of you for the work that you're doing. I want to thank you for your contributions to the journal and to this conversation. Just thank you. This was an enlightening conversation. Please join me in thanking our panel.